crops, and we asked them why they changed to doing this. And he did this word thing. I'm not quite sure how it works, but it really looks at the bigger the word is, the more often people mention is the reason they switched to no-till corn. So if we look at the two big ones, it's fuel and time. And so Heather Darby and I from the University of Vermont, we did a little study and we figured out it probably saves about $50 an acre by growing no-till corn versus plowing and harrowing and planting into a tilled field. So $50 an acre in both time and fuel. So labor and diesel fuel. So the other reason you want to grow no-till corn, it's been around for many, many years. The number one reason people do that is for erosion control. The less you till the soil, the less prone it's going to be to erosion. So here's an example of a field on the right-hand side that was tilled, a field on the left side, planted no-till after a heavy rainstorm. And you can see the difference in the runoff of both of those. So a big difference in water quality potential between the two systems. We've done a rainfall simulator at Maine Farm Days and showed that. Some of you have seen that simulator, some of you haven't. But it shows the same effect. We have better infiltration, so water goes in rather than running off. Compared from tilled field, it's going to run off. No-till field, it infiltrates. So think about that when it comes to the beginning of August. We haven't had rain for 4 weeks. Which field is going to do better? It's the field that had the water that went in the ground rather than off the ground. Okay? So here's just an example. The field, look on the right-hand side, it was tilled without a cover crop. You see erosion, left-hand side. You still see the remnants of the dead cover crop, and no erosion. So the other thing I think about it is, we're trying to build a system that's going to be less susceptible to big climate changes, whether it's going to be more drought, more rainfall, we don't know. We're seeing bigger events, one way or the other, whether it's drought or rainfall. And with a no-till system, we have less variability. We get better conservation of water. We also have the ability to withstand droughts. And we also have the ability to get on fields a little bit earlier when they're wet. So, example of field on the right was tilled. Field on the left, the section on the left was no-till. This is from a few years ago. And we had a very wet spring, but we had a dry summer. So the field on the left was no-till, did very well. The field on the right dried out, and it was tilled. This was at Ingram's, real sandy soil. We did the same thing at another farm last year. This is in Albion. Field on the right was tilled, field on the left was no-till. Same soil, the only difference is the road in between. Same practices, just the difference. So, the other thing I like about no-till corn, and these guys will probably talk about it, it allows for crop rotation. A lot of you probably had cornfields that have been corn for how many years, Dwayne? A lot, okay? So when we think about it...
Still does 32.
No, you can't quantify it. Okay? You can say that, but I bet you it'll do better if you took it out and put it into rotation. Okay? So, all studies are going to show you if you rotate your crops, whether it's from sod to corn or corn to sod, you're going to see an increase in yield. Okay? And that's going to be 10 to 15%, and that's probably going to happen for a 2 or 3 year period. You're going to disrupt weed cycles, pest cycles, lots of reasons to rotate. So there's also other things that go along with that. A lot of work has been done on saying, well, we're going to grow no-till corn and grow cover crops. Maybe we can harvest the cover crops as feed. So we had Tom Kilser here last year who talked about wide swathing hay, but he also talks about the fact that you can grow winter triticale as a cover crop and harvest that as a feed. So lots of options, lots of different things you can do. So example, this is Jimmy Hilton's field. Jimmy Hilton did triticale a couple of years, harvested triticale, and then planted corn through it. And this is from Larry Ward's farm. And all those little dimples are what? Wormholes. So farmers look at fields and say, look at all that worm activity. That's a sign of good soil quality and good soil health. All those wormholes are places where water can infiltrate rather than run off the field. So you also need to think about these cover crops that go along with no-till as the other side of the farm, meaning the other side of the calendar. It grows really well in September, October, and it will into November. It grows early in the spring. So you're actually capturing solar radiation during that period as well. So some farms look at cover crops as a way to hold manure on the field. The fields will dry up quicker in the spring if it's got a cover crop on it. Heather Darby's done some data. I'm not going to go through the data, but it shows that fields will dry up quicker if they've got an actively growing cover crop on it. So I said I'd talk a little bit about the bad. I don't really want to, but I will. There are some downsides. Okay, you need to think about what you can do for weed control. What are your options? You know, GMO corn makes it a lot easier. Roundup Ready corn makes it easier. Does it really work on heavy soils? How are you going to manage manure? You're not going to till, you're not going to incorporate it. Some challenges there. What do you do when you go and you harvest in the fall and there's all these ruts left over, right? Tom Cody always talks about the fact that, you know, when we harvest in the fall, we're leaving lots of ruts in the field. We've got to do something about that. That can be an issue. And then there are some other issues. Disease issues potential. Armyworms, potentially there. So weeds, definitely an issue. Lots of different weed problems you can come up with. Jeff and Penny will notice that one from the front yard. Okay, so you need to think about how you're going to handle weeds. How you're going to do it post-emergence. You can think about pre-emergence. Timing's important. You know, when do you kill that cover crop? All that's important. You can't let things go too far. Armyworms. How do you handle manure? How many years ago did everyone remember I used to tell you to have to plow and harrow that manure in to conserve all that nitrogen? Now I'm telling you to spread it on top and forget it. Well, I think cover crops make the difference. When you apply that manure, if you apply it to an actively growing cover crop, more likely you're going to conserve a lot of that nitrogen versus losing it. Okay? You know, some of the things are important too as well. So there's some bad parts. You know, we need to think about that. How do we get that corn in the ground at the right depth? How do we set your equipment? It takes a little bit more challenge to make sure your equipment, your planters are set up correctly. You know, we don't want this situation where you're trying to plant corn into a wet field and not closing that slit up. There's corn seed in there. I don't know if you can see that, but there is corn seed in there somewhere. So, you know, we want good soil seed contact just like we would in a regular tilled field. And your equipment has to be maintained and cared for. So. The other challenge is getting a cover crop on. How do you do that? Duncan left earlier. Duncan and his dad built these interseeders. We've had people try plane seeders. We've tried lots of different ways of getting cover crops established because there's always a challenge at the end of the year to get that cover crop on. So this is a picture that Dave Barker sent me from when he was picking his corn, and that's the cover crop that established pretty well on that corn. But we did some plane seedings, and anybody figure out what happened here? This is in Misty Meadows. What happened here? They did a plane seeding cover crop.
Plane crash.
This is the right-hand side is where we chopped the corn ahead of the farm days. So there wasn't any corn there when the plane came over and seeded it. Where the field on the left is, or the section on the left is where the corn was. So we're having some problems getting the seed where it's supposed to be in terms of in the ground. The corn intercepts it, we don't get good germination. Plain seeding doesn't always work. I think people say it's pretty variable sometimes. I want to shout out to Agaloma. Agaloma Farms does a great job with cover crops. As soon as that corn chopper is off the field, they're in there with the fertilizer spreader, spreading winter rye, and they take it with a flexible tine harrow. Is that what you use, Harold? Flexible tine harrow to incorporate it. And that field is planted almost the day, or during the same day that that corn is getting chopped off. It's a priority for them now. And it does a great job. When I drive to work and I drive past this field every day, I smile. It makes me happy. There's some issues with herbicide carryover with cover crops sometimes, and there's some other issues. Is this an issue with, we're going to see what happened there. I don't know if you can see it very well, but lots of bird damage. Not anything to do with no-till or cover crops. But.
We no-till about 600 acres every year. We raise over 100 acres of barley, 150 acres of soybeans. We no-till our alfalfa, new seed, and that's usually run from 30 to 50 acres. We no-till all our corn. We plant about 250 acres. Probably 80 of that is devoted to high moisture cob corn. So every spring we're doing about 600 acres. We have quite an extensive rotation because all those crops we raise. We aren't 100% on our cover crops yet. That is a challenge in our short growing season, but we do, unlike our barley, we do, when we plant our barley, we also put down Italian ryegrass, which stays short, which means we can harvest our barley without any interference, and then we have a cover crop established after the barley goes off. On some of our corn ground, we've experimented with spinning winter rye on. Also experimented with some multiple cover crop species, but it is a challenge, especially on our soybean ground, because that's taken off in October and November. But with our rotation and what cover crops we do, and with the residue from our cob corn, we really have improved our soils over the years.
I got started pretty much by accident. We were going to seed down a piece of ground, and we had fall killed this Timothy sod because we were going to till it up and seed it down in the springtime, and it was a wet spring, and it got late and we never got it done. We were done planting corn, and the corn planter still had some seed in it and fertilizer, and I told Travis, I said, Travis, that's my son, I said, go plant that. I said, it's not gonna work, but we're not gonna get to seed it down till August anyway, so who cares? But get rid of that seed, clean that planter up, and seed that, and put corn in that. Best crop of corn we'd had in probably 20 years. So, like I said, it was by accident that we stumbled onto it, and I was absolutely amazed at what we got for a yield, and I'm also fortunate that I've been able to work with potato growers in our area for the last one in particular I probably worked with for 35 years, and ground has probably been extensively tilled for 75 years, so I really know what poor health soil is. I've got a real good grasp on what poor health is, and we had it without a doubt, and once we started to see the health benefits, and in reality that's why we do no-till. I'm more focused on soil health, and if you can figure out how to get soil health and till every year, have at it. I don't care how you do it. I think most of you, once you figure out the value of soil health, and especially water movement, infiltration, it took us a long time to realize the importance of infiltration. We were fighting with erosion all the time on our steep ground, and we had more diversion ditches, and we were doing a lot with fall covers, but we were doing them for erosion control, and we were still losing that battle until we got good soil health and good infiltration rates. It just has really changed our soil erosion with that infiltration rate, and that is really the key to me. Is the biggest changes we've seen is infiltration rates. We have probably bulldozed in miles of diversion ditches because with good infiltration rates and good rotations and cover most of the time, we just don't need those ditches anymore. And I hated ditches as they failed. It brought all the water to one place, and then it'd go over the ditch and create all kinds of problems. We'd put culverts in the end of them, and I'd be the first one to run over it and spoil it, and then the water would come down the ditch, get down the headland. So we've done away with all our ditches, but the soil infiltration rate and that to stop the erosion has probably been one of our biggest gains. And we're probably 1,000 acres of no-till corn, 500 acres of alfalfa, 300 or 400 acres of Timothy, and we haven't tilled anything probably in 6 or 7 years. And I'm not against tillage. If I made a huge mess somewhere in the fall, I'd just harrow it out, because it has absolutely amazed me how quick ground will go from no soil health at all, that you couldn't find a worm if your life depended on it. 3 years later, we changed more in 3 years than I thought we'd change in a lifetime. You know, it took us 75 years to get from what was real good that I never saw down to really degraded soils. And it changes, you know, in 3 or 4 years you really see a dramatic change. So I'm in my mind, there's a lot of purists out there that are like, I'm never gonna do any tillage. You know, if I have to do it to smooth it up, we'll do that. We still have potatoes in the rotation. They're in there every 3, 4 years, sometimes 2 years, and obviously we have to do tillage then, and we'll put cover crops on following those potatoes, and we just have seen a huge impact. This year, behind potatoes where there'd be truck roads and the potatoes aren't going to put cover crops in 2 days later, and the wormholes in that, the work that you'd see would be, it's absolutely mind-boggling to me, the tillage those worms will do for you.
Jeff Stevens, and we're Wingate Farm, and we have a different situation because we have more rocks and more ledge than these guys, and we especially like no-till because of the rocks. But you can go into a ledgy field, you can plant right over that, and just hold your breath, and 10 days later that corn will come up. You know, and that is our first impression after we started, and then we started finding out about soil quality and all the other good things that came with it. But you know, we do 150 acres of corn, and we may do 30 acres of alfalfa, so it's not quite the same as the other two, but you know, it's worked really well for us. And for us, it was, the other biggest thing was time, because we're still milking, and hey, somebody's got to get out there and spread the manure and get that corn planted, and so we can get first crop off. So it's considerable time saving.
And it allows us to plant corn. In our little neck of the woods, every field is fought over, basically. I mean, because there's a few farms left, and we all need every square acre that we can get. So we planted fields that I vowed we would never put corn in again, because we finally got them straightened out, and we don't hit any rocks in them anymore. Well, now they're back to corn because we needed the rotation. We needed to put grass or alfalfa in another field, and so we said, okay, this one is going to be corn. But it works. It works really well. And we had some old ledge pastures that we've been able to put corn into. It's going to be a challenge to get them back into grass, but we will do it. And it really, really works. And it saves time, and it saves money running the tractors. When the price of fuel 3 years ago was so through the roof, I mean, we could pay the bill still, pay the fuel bill. And for a small operation, it's worked really, really well for our size. And, you know, I said right from the start, it doesn't look like it's going to work, but if you plant it, the corn will come up. And it does, year after year.
We started with an old planter, so we have upgraded to a newer version, and now we can change our population, but typically we run about 34,000.
I think on planters, the biggest thing is maintenance. I think seed opening disc, it's very important that those are set up right and are fairly new and sharp. And if you think of a dull jackknife versus a sharp jackknife, you know, a sharp one you can saw your finger right off in a heartbeat, and a good dull one you can saw quite a while and not even have to put a stitch in. I think if your seed disc are sharp, that is number one. I don't care if you've got the best planter out there that'll give you 10,000 pounds per square inch of down pressure. If you've got seed discs that are gapped open a half an inch and a dull, you're not going to do the job. So I think that's the most important thing. We have upgraded planters to have pneumatic down pressure and stuff, but I don't think that's necessary at all. We had to get a bigger planter, so we got that technology. I think if you're willing to, with our old planter, sharp opening disc, we change those every year, every other year. If you're getting some real hard ground, just keep your seed hoppers full. You know, that's a lot of weight. We never had any troubles. As soil health gets better, it gets easier and easier to get penetrated into that soil.
I bought my planter in 1985, and I still got it, and that's what I updated. So it doesn't take a new planter. There's all kinds of equipment out there today that you can add to these old planters to make them work. And I think Bobby's right, the opening discs need to be set up right. There's certain things you can do to test to see if they're touching for a certain length of time as they rotate around, and also they need to be sharp. And you know, you do hit rocks once in a while or some ledge, and that can dull them up, so you need to pay attention to that. That's probably one of the more important things. But and also, the longer you no-till, the easier it is to penetrate that soil. And it's just no question about it. In fact, I got a story. We were fortunate enough to, a few years ago, we picked up some ground that had been in CRP for 20 years. So, I mean, it hadn't been tilled for 20 years, and it was in some type of sod crop originally. It was planted to grass and a few other things. But that year that I picked that up, we weren't able to kill that sod until the springtime, and I was really worried about penetration on this ground because it had a lot of residue on the top of it. The old sod was thick, and I was really concerned whether I was going to penetrate that. So I set my planter up, and then I went a few feet, and I discovered penetration. Not having the planter penetrate was not the problem. I mean, it was the problem in that it was going too. The guy was putting corn 4 or 5 inches deep. So I had to lighten up. You have springs on these you can adjust for your downforce. I had to lighten everything up. That planter wanted to sink out of sight in that soil. So that just kind of tells you that the longer you're in no-till, the better that soil's going to be, and a lot easier to plant no-till. Even seeding down, I've noticed that when I first started seeding down no-till, I'd end up with a lot of rocks on top. And we kind of have to pick those off. But this soil that I have in no-till, I don't even bring up rocks now when I'm seeding down. And that's just not an issue. Just don't bring that stuff up anymore because that soil has changed. It seems to be softer on top, more residue there, so that just makes it easier to plant overall. It's just unreal how your soil changes over time.
We do cover crops extensively between the potato side of ours, which is a grower that I work with, and our corn. It's probably 1,200 acres, and every bit of that will get cover crops. We've done it a lot of different ways. We have air-type seeder on a 12-row cultivator that we took all the units off. I'll usually do 300 acres that way around, first week in July. That seems to be quite successful. I've done a lot with helicopters and airplanes. It has been successful, but I don't like the cost. My requirement for accepting things, it's got to be easy, fast, and low cost. Plane got me easy and fast, but I didn't like the cost. But I was convinced we had to do some aerial because I thought it had to be done in August in my mind. I thought if we did what we did in July because of herbicide carryover and this, that, and another, I just really didn't think it was going to work. So we started out doing a lot with planes and helicopters, but we kept trying in the spring, and we've got so the herbicide thing doesn't scare me anymore. As we've done more and more no-till, weed control has got easier and easier, and I keep cutting chemicals back and back. And I'm convinced at some point we'll figure out how to do it with no chemicals, and there's people that have, but I'm not there yet. I'm not brave enough because I've been bit by weeds too many times. And certainly on the weed part of it, your sprayer becomes your tillage tool. The biggest failure I see a lot of people make is weed control. I mean, and if you think about it, when you were doing tillage, that first tillage pass is your first control of weeds, and when you're in no-till, you miss that first control of weeds. So you might no-till into a piece and think, boy, there's no weeds there, but there might be a million of them that you can't even really quite see yet, that you killed with the tillage process that you did not kill under a no-till situation, and they can get away from you in a hurry. So I think the takeaway from me, the biggest thing is you really got to be on top of weeds. And I think it's easy once you get aware of it. We do all pre-emergence one pass and then come back with Roundup, later on. It's an easy system, but you gotta be on top of it because they can get away from you in a hurry because they've got a good start on you. That the tillage system used to, you would start out even.
As soon as we chop our corn, we go right around with a drill our winter rye right in. As long as the guy on the drill stays up with the guy on the chopper, he's good. But once that chopper gets out of sight, he gets discouraged pretty quick. But other than that, it's worked out good.
Yeah, we'll still put winter rye on everything, even though we'll put usually ryegrass, tillage radish, turnip, and clover in the first time. And that can get kind of discouraging as yields get better. I mean, I call it successful. I think we have to change our definition of what a successful cover crop is. We're not after erosion control anymore. You know, I'm after that cover and the importance of that. But under a heavy corn crop, it is tough to get something established because of daylight. And you can see that when you put it on with a plane or a cultivator, air seeder. If you happen to put seed on where they picked up over a rock with a planter or someplace you turn too wide and there was a little daylight, the cover crop will always be mind-boggling. So there's not a doubt in my mind, as long as you pay attention to herbicide, that the biggest trouble with establishing a corn crop, you know, a cover crop under a 25-ton corn is really hard. If you want an excellent cover crop, do it under a 10-ton crop of corn, and it'll be a beautiful cover crop. But we tend to get something established, and by the time we chop it off and get some daylight, it really responds very well. But I will still come back, depending on what it looks like. If it looks a little sketchy, I might put 75 pounds of winter rye on. If it looks real sketchy, I might put 100 on. If it looks good, sometimes I won't put any on. But most generally, I'll still always put 50 on because I like a real lush green cover in the springtime. Because we're in the worm feeding business with our cover crop. That's really all we're doing it for. It's not erosion control, it's feeding worms, and it absolutely amazes me. I'll kill a cover crop that'll be, you know, way up over your knees, unbelievable stand, and you're planting that, and by 4th of July, you can't find enough of that on the ground to amount to a darn. Those worms have hauled every bit of that in underground. And that is absolutely amazing to see that. And in reality, in the whole soil health and the whole scheme of things, the cover crop business, that's what you're doing. So you're feeding it. And when you're feeding worms, there's a million other things you're feeding besides that. But I don't even try to figure that out. I know if I got worms and they're eating it, that the whole system is working very well. Boy, manure could be scary on cover crops and what you do when we'd start out, especially in the fall, putting fall applied manure on, it'd be a little wet, and we'd say, boy, I hate to run over all that cover crop. But it's not optional. So you just put it on and completely disregard that cover crop. The response from that manure, it's a win-win every time. You throw that nitrogen on, I don't care how much you run it and pack it down and think you spoiled it, you helped it every time. So we have just disregarded. We just spread manure like we always have, except we don't till it in. But it's certainly, there's no question with good infiltration, the amount of wormholes, you know, most of that, we used to, when we would spread, it was a given rule, we spread everything with trucks. You never take a truck on where you've just spread. You just do not do that, because if you do, you're stuck. Now, if you spread the length of the field, and if you wait 10 minutes, you could drive back on that, because that is, you know, sunk into the ground and dried out. It's just completely different how quick that manure goes in and how it manages it. One thing we try to do with manure now, I've noticed, especially we separate solids from our manure, so a lot of it is just 100% liquid. And if soil moisture is really real wet already, I'm careful about. And sometimes it's not optional, but I've noticed it's pretty easy to drown a lot of worms if you come in on real wet ground and then put on 10,000 gallons of liquid manure. You see quite a few dead worms on the top of the ground, and that just breaks my heart to see that. So we're getting so, you know, and we haven't really started, because last year's the first year I noticed that, but we will try to maybe do a light pass twice rather than, you know, if conditions are really wet, rather than drown a bunch of worms.
Well, for us, we also spread some biosolids, other than, you know, we spread manure, but we have done some biosolids as well, compost and stuff. And we had a little issue with that being heavier and not having to spread out on a couple of fields. And the no-till had no problem, but the worms didn't really like it much. So that's something we're gonna have to be more aware of in the future, is making sure that those biosolids, the compost, goes on in a more even layer. Because we just had spots where it just sat on the top and dried out. Of course, last year was quite dry anyways, and we had issues with that. For spreading manure, our fall spreading, we usually go on our grass ground anyways. We don't fall spread our corn ground because the rye that we've put down hasn't really had a chance to come up yet. We'll spread our rye ground, and we just don't have a lot of problems. We don't get stuck much anymore. We stay away from the wet holes, but we don't have the same issues that we did before we started going no-till.
Well, I guess you have to get off that mindset it needs to be incorporated. I don't like to put it on bare ground. I like to put manure on some cover crop or some soil that has some residue on it. That seems to work a lot better. I mean, and normally when we do spread, we have that. So that's what you have to work toward. Putting that manure on some ground that has cover crop on it, or at least some residue to help soak some of those nutrients up. And I just like Bobby mentioned about all the worms. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I had a field that I think the more residue you can get on that field, the more worms you have, and I think those will correct some of your drainage problems. For example, I had a farm that we rented that had a few wet holes in it, and I was able to get a cover crop on one year, and then the next year I didn't, and I think we put some, we harvested the cob corn on that farm that year and left all that corn residue there. And last spring I went to put barley on that field, which is one of the first things I plant real early. We had a wet spring and late spring last year, and I planted through these wet holes, which just surprised me. I just couldn't believe, knowing the season we had, the temperatures we had, that I was able to go through these wet holes. And I think because I had more residue on that field the year before, I think that's what the worms like. I think you increase the population. I think in those areas we must increase the wormholes enough so it made a difference in the drainage. So that's just an observation I have. It's not really proven, but you have to feed that system, and the more you feed that system, the more of these beneficial animals you have in your soil to improve your soil health.
Well, I mean, I think weed control is number one. I think, like I said, when I watch what some people have done, and even for us in the beginning when I was depending on someone else spraying and getting it done, weed control, I think Roger Whitney said it best to me, your sprayer becomes your tiller's tool, and I think that's absolutely true. I'm in my sprayer all the time, you know. It's a 2-pass system now where it used to be 1. Very little chemicals both trip, but you got to be aware of weeds and keep track of them. I think cover crops is very, very important. I think, you know, if you were in a farming system that you did a lot of rotation and you were, you know, doing corn 2 years in a row, and then you knew it was going to be seeded down in Timothy or alfalfa for 2 or 3 years, I think you could disregard cover crops. But for us, you know, and I'm not recommending that you should, but I think you could get away with it. But in our system where we have potatoes in it, and you know, I think cover crops is a big part of it. You got to still, it's just like all things, you have to have good soil seed contact. It takes a good planter operator. My son does the planting, he's very patient. I wouldn't be any good at it because I'm like, I need to get this done, and I start going, and I think the planter man has to be that type of a patient person that can get out and look and dig and change things and catch on to that. You know, you can't just start going and do 150 acres and then get off and see what it looked like. It sometimes will change throughout the day and you have to make some changes.
Our biggest thing, just don't be afraid. I mean, it's gonna work, so, I mean, go out and do it.
Don't be afraid, but at the same time, be aware. And know that you're gonna have to check your corn, and you're gonna have to rotate your fields. Because 40 years of the same field of corn, it doesn't make sense. Because when you put it into a field that was something else, your yields go up so much. And I mean, we were the same fields, always in corn, it's easier to turn over, but then we had winter kill in an alfalfa field. We put that into corn, and it was like, this field never produced this well before. It was one of our best fields, because the alfalfa winter killed, and we didn't do anything different, we just no-till planted the corn into this dead alfalfa field. So, but believe that it's gonna work. And don't think that you're gonna lose a lot because you do no-till. You gain on the other end.
Well, I think the biggest thing you need to do is just get another tractor. You know, you have different soil types, you have different fields. You need every once in a while to get another tractor and make sure that seed is where you want to place it. That's very important. And you need a good sprayer. You know, you were relying on tillage before, and that took out a lot of your weeds. Now you're relying on a sprayer, and you need to. When I started out, I had a 40-foot boom on my sprayer, and I found out I just couldn't cover the ground that I wanted to one day. So I ended up, you know, getting something a little bigger, a little wider. But that's important. And one thing that's made this a lot easier is Roundup Ready corn. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, we are to the point today, if something happened to Roundup Ready corn and we couldn't use it, we could get by with no-till, no problem at all, that experience. But when you start out, Roundup Ready corn is very important, because if you didn't get them the first time, say you did pre-emergence, you can always go back and clean out those weeds afterwards. So it's really, I think Roundup Ready corn has really speeded up the adoption of no-till in the United States.